I love parades, or I used to love parades. That's a better way to start. When I was younger, I loved parades. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan, in a town called Osler, where everybody knew everybody. When the parade went around, you knew every single person and every single float going by. And these great crowds of people, and you're all part of one big family, and every single float is throwing candy, because that's really what I was in it for, is the candy, even though it was mostly rock hard double bubble. You remember those days? But I loved it. We would show up with our BMXs and our bags because we just followed the parade and just collected the candy. And then I got to relive all of this joy when I moved to Hepburn, and we had two little girls who also just got in there and loved parades and loved seeing all the things go by. And Hepburn's kind of special because the parade is so small, it only lasts 10 minutes, and so they circle around and they do it again. Just love those days. And every single time we get to this time in our calendar on Palm Sunday where we celebrate the triumphal entry, I think about a parade. I think about God's big parade where there's lots of crowds and lots of shouts and celebrations. And so that's what I want to focus on this morning. And I've preached several times on a Palm Sunday before, but I've never preached out of the Luke text, the Gospel of Luke. We've been going through Luke as a congregation, and Jonathan said, yeah, it'd be good if you just jumped ahead to the part of the story in Luke where he talks about the triumphal entry. And so this is new for me. This was a new wrestling match with the text, and I invite you into what I discovered in the last week or two. And so let's get in there with Luke 19, verses 28 to 34. He writes, after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead. Going up to Jerusalem, he approached Bethpage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives. He sent two of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it? Say, the Lord needs it. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? They replied, the Lord needs it. And the story ends there. Jesus and his disciples arrive at Bethany. So they've been on this long journey from the most northern place in Israel, Caesarea Philippi, and they get down to Jericho where they meet Bartimaeus and that whole story. And then after they leave Jericho, they climb the hill. They climb up towards Jerusalem, and they get to a place called Bethpage, or the area of Bethpage that has the town Bethany, and that's where Jesus is. And Jesus has friends in Bethany, his friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, their brother. And so he's sort of at home here. It's comfortable, but he knows he needs to make his way now to Jerusalem. And so he sends his disciples westward from Bethany, probably to the Bethpage area, and he gives them instructions of how to find a donkey colt. We don't know if there's a conversation that it's not recorded in the gospel or any of the gospels, whether there's some like pre-arrangements, maybe a few weeks ago, maybe last year they said, by the way, we're going to be coming and we're going to need something to ride. Is there any way you could have a donkey colt ready? We don't hear any of that. Is there a pre-arrangement conversation? We wouldn't know it. We're not told that. I'm imagining maybe something, because it's either that or it's weird. Yeah, have you ever read this story and thought, that's weird? That they just went ahead and took someone else's donkey colt. And then when they said, hey, what are you doing? That's mine. And then they just said, the Lord needs it. And that's somehow code language. Oh, okay. I guess that's good then. It's especially weird because, maybe Lord was associated with Jesus at this time. Maybe that started. But Lord, Kyrios in Greek, it meant Yahweh. It meant God. God needs it. Oh, if God needs it, then we're good to go. I don't know how it happened, but that is the backdrop for what happens next. Let's keep reading Luke 19:35. They brought it, the donkey colt, to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down, the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all of the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." Oh, I wish I could have been there. This is one parade I would have wanted to see. And to know that this crowd is coming, the people of Jerusalem, the crowds in Jerusalem go, it's happening, guys, and they rush out of the city, out of the temple gate and over the bridge towards the Mount of Olives where this is all happening. And as they go there, they're probably picking up olive branches and palm branches and they're getting ready. And then they come up to, and there's this crowd following Jesus and there's lots of noise and celebration. And they begin to wave their branches, throwing them on the road before Jesus, saying, "Hosanna, Hosanna, save us," and praising God. And then they come down the Mount of Olives and then across the bridge and back in through the gates, through the Golden Gate, the east side of the Temple Mount, sometimes called the Gate of Mercy. They go through the Gate of Mercy and into the temple. Oh, what a scene. There's no bridge in Luke. You can see on the picture there, I'm not sure if you can spot it, but I actually drew the bridge. I know it blends in, and you can hardly notice it, but I drew it where I think it happened because it goes up right to that blue box where the Golden Gate or the Mercy Gate is, okay? And that's the bridge that they cross, but Luke doesn't mention a bridge, and neither do the other gospel writers. In fact, you can't find anywhere in the whole Bible that talks about this bridge. Okay, so then I went to Josephus because he talks a lot about the things of that area, and I thought surely Josephus is going to mention this bridge because there was a bridge that crossed the Kidron Valley. There had to have been, and Josephus doesn't mention it at all. But then I found it. I found it in the Talmud, which is the Jewish religious book that contains the Mishnah, which was from the oral law. And in the Mishnah, it talks about a ritual called the red heifer ritual. You can read about it in Numbers 19, I believe it is, where they practice this outside of the tent. A red heifer had to been taken by a priest outside the tent. There was cleanness and that's uncleanness things going on. And they had to take it outside the tent. And so the way that the Mishnah explains it is that a priest had to take it outside the temple toward the Mount of Olives. And the way the Mishnah describes this is they crossed the causeway, which was a bridge of arches upon arches that spanned across the Kidron Valley towards the Mount of Olives. Oh, yeah, there it is. So the archaeologists did their work and they went there and they didn't find a single piece of evidence that there was ever a bridge across the Kidron. And I don't know, was there a bridge? I think there was. I imagine a bridge. You don't have to, because Luke doesn't say it. I'm imagining a bridge. Luke also doesn't say that anyone was saying Hosanna. I don't know if you noticed. Yeah, we sing Hosanna, save us, or probably in that time a generic word for praise. And Luke doesn't have Hosanna. He kind of uses his words actually. Instead, he just says praising God with loud voices. That's sort of like Hosanna. And then he adds, in complete gospel proclamation mode, blessed be the King. Yeah, blessed is the King. The King has come home. This is the return of the King. Now, the Pharisees want Jesus to rebuke his disciples when they say that. And at first sight, I think my thought was, because that's blasphemy. But actually, it's not blasphemy. Blasphemy would have been if the disciples or the crowds would have been saying, Jesus is God. That's blasphemy. But to declare Jesus as king has actually more to do with some political arrangement that the Jews have to remain as they are, as long as they're okay with Caesar being the king. So Jesus, if you could tell your disciples just to tone it down, there could be some Romans listening, and we don't want to get into trouble. So rebuke them, tone it down. And that's when Jesus grabs Habakkuk and prophesies, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. These inanimate objects are gonna form mouths, right? All of creation is bursting at the seams to tell the truth about who this is. He's the king. So why can't you see it, Mr. Pharisee? So there's no bridge. There's no Hosanna. Are you ready for this? There's no palm branches. It's Palm Sunday. There's no palm branches in Luke. Actually, there's no branches. They throw their cloaks on the ground, not branches. Matthew has branches, not palm. Mark has leafy branches. Maybe that's a palm branch. I don't know. John's the only one who mentions palm. It's in the Bible. We're okay with the palms. John's the only one who also explicitly tells us that there was a crowd in Jerusalem that heard that this was happening, and they rushed out of the city across the bridge towards the Mount of Olives to meet up with this parade to usher them then back, which is actually exactly how all people would have responded when their king was coming back from travels or their general was coming back from victory on the battlefield. The people would hear about it and they would rush out of the city, line the roads, and in parade fashion, welcome their general or their king home back into the city. What a beautiful celebration, what a beautiful event. Now let's turn to the remaining 4 verses of Luke's telling of this story, which is different than the other 3 gospel accounts. And it's different in a sort of a sobering way. It took a little bit for me to sort of wrap my mind around what's going on and wrestle with what Luke has to tell us about how Jesus now responds as he sees Jerusalem when they come over the hill. Verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. That sits a little heavier. And let's just be clear right out the outset here. Jesus is not saying this because he wants this. Jesus is just telling the truth about what they're up to and what's going to happen. So he looks over the Kidron Valley and he sees Jerusalem. He sees the city and he weeps. Now he could have wept while riding the donkey colt, so the parade sort of continues and he's weeping. That could have happened. I'm imagining he stops. It doesn't say he stops, but that's sort of how I imagine the scene. And if Jesus stops, everyone stops. And that's more of a scene now. That's more memorable in terms of what just happened here and why is Jesus crying? Jesus weeps over the city like Jeremiah did. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem like Isaiah did. He repeats this compassion that pours out on this lost people, this broken people. And then he pronounces judgment. And his first word of judgment is indicating how good it could have been had Jesus arrived in peace. If you, only you, could know how good it could have been had I arrived in peace. but now this has been hidden from your eyes. And then secondly, forecasting that the sins of Jerusalem are bringing on consequences that will lead to their destruction, with all sorts of detail, an embankment, an encircling, and a killing of innocents. What is interesting to me is that Jesus spoke this prophetic word over Jerusalem, and then he didn't leave. Jesus condemns the sin of Israel by prophesying consequences that sin in Jerusalem, and then he didn't leave. I would have left, pretty sure. I would have had a good cry. I would have said what I needed to say, and then I would have gone somewhere else. I would have found a better spot than go into that ugly place. That's what I would have done, I'm pretty sure. And I would have done it because my judgment is thin. I know you're probably thinking, we thought better of you, Jeff. My judgment's shallow. I'm full of anger and accusations and self-righteousness when it all comes down to it. I have vengeance in me. I'd be more like James and John. Bring the fire from heaven. Let's clean this place up. God, you know what to do. I would do this because I have remnants of that kind of God in my heart and in my mind. And that's why I need Jesus, who shows us who God really is. Because God saw Jerusalem and he wept. God saw Jerusalem and he judged. He told them the truth about their condition. And then God saw Jerusalem and he entered it willingly and on purpose. Voluntarily, he entered the judgment. That's called mercy. We learn in verse 45, and as we keep on reading throughout the rest of Luke, that Jesus enters the city, he enters the temple, he enters the religious system, he enters the political system, he enters into every part of that city, and he brings his judgment with him. God doesn't stand at a distance and send in his judgments from afar. He enters it up close, and then he bears it. In Jerusalem. Jerusalem means city of peace, city of Salem or Shalom. And upon this city is the burden of heralding the way that the world should be, of pointing the world to how things should end up. Jerusalem was to be the place of mercy for the world. And it became the place of condemnation. And so, plot twist, Jesus comes, knowing that Jerusalem cannot be the place of mercy. He becomes the place of mercy. Paul writes to the church in Rome, to the Christians in Rome. And in Romans chapter 3, verse 25, it says exactly this: God put Jesus forth as the place of mercy. Now, if you're looking through your translations going, I've never heard this before, you're probably going to find something like he put Jesus forth as a sacrifice of atonement or as propitiation. And then we go, what does that mean? It means place of mercy. We're a little bit more comfortable with talking about Jesus as the sacrifice because, well, that's true. So we sort of insert that here when Paul's trying to talk about God's righteousness. God put Jesus forth as a sacrifice. It's true, but that's not what Paul says here. The word here is hilasterion, if you care. It's only used twice in the New Testament, but it's used way more in the Old Testament to describe the lid or the cover of the Ark of the Covenant that sat in the Holy of Holies. The lid in which the priests would, after sacrificing, take blood and sprinkle it on this cover, or what we sometimes call the mercy seat. Yeah, the hilasterion. This is the place of mercy. And God put Jesus forth as the place of mercy through his faithfulness by his blood. Why? To demonstrate his promises, to demonstrate his covenant justice, or to demonstrate his righteousness, his ability to make right between you and I and us and him. You see, now I'm thinking the triumphal entry. God's big parade is just a big parade of mercy. A parade that comes down the Mount of Olives and goes through the gate of mercy, where then Jesus can ultimately become embodied, the place of mercy. The King has come home, and he's come home to set all things right, and he does it in his judgment as mercy. By putting evil on trial, pronouncing evil guilty, and then if we read to the very end, spoiler alert, Jesus rises from the dead. And then there's final victory over all of evil and death in his mercy. By doing this, he gives us an amazing path to walk, Jesus does. And Luke describes this so beautifully. I'm going to call this Luke's ministry template that you and I are invited into. Because you and I are ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ if we follow Jesus. And you and I bump into evil or brokenness or sin, things that are tearing apart. And Luke invites us to feel that moment and to be moved to compassion and to weep. And some of us have been weeping. We do this already. And then Luke tells us the second thing is that we judge or we tell the truth. This world needs truth. This world needs a proclamation of this is good and this is not good. And so judging is sort of like just holding up a mirror and making sure that we can see ourselves and go, wow, that wasn't good. We need to tell the truth about that. And so we weep, we feel, and then we tell the truth about it. And then we enter it. We enter the mess and we enter the pain and we help bear it. See, telling the truth and not entering it rarely helps. Isn't it wonderful that we're invited to that third step of entering into God's mercy with other people? Well, as you can tell, I've been wrestling with things, and there's just so many things that I would have unpacked from Luke's story. I just loved my own study, but two things maybe I want to bring as takeaways for us here this morning. One having to do with who's God, and maybe the other one, how should we respond? So the first one is God's judgment is his mercy. God's judgment is his self-giving and self-sacrificial love. This is mercy. As Jonathan mentioned, we're going to be entering Passion Week, and we're going to be recounting all of the events, including the arrest and trial of Jesus, and on Friday, the crucifixion and the death and burial of Jesus, and on Sunday, the resurrection. And as we do, can I invite you to consider that this is how God judges the world? The crucified Messiah, the God who is judge over all things, are not two, but one. God judges by taking the evils and the sins of the world upon himself. He doesn't overreact and fly off the handle. He doesn't ignore the seriousness of sin and the damage of sin. He takes every sin, every harm, every violation, every insult, every wound, every ache, everything we do, everything done to us very seriously, and he judges all of it in himself. Paul writes to the Corinthians, as we know as 2 Corinthians, the letter, God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ. not counting people's sins against them. Now, this doesn't mean that people don't live with their consequences. We don't get off scot-free, as we might say today. In fact, Jerusalem does, in fact, experience everything that Jesus forecasts for them. Only 40 years later, 70 AD, Rome lays the entire city to utter waste, with a special emphasis of tearing down the temple. Jesus doesn't demonstrate that God is soft on crime. In fact, he demonstrates the seriousness of sin in ways that human suffering just simply can never account for. You see, humans cannot even begin to balance the budget for the pain that we inflict on each other. We need Jesus. And so when we think that humans still need to pay for their crimes, we fail to see the gravity of God's judgment on sin as Jesus hangs on the cross. We always have to live through those consequences. But when we think that humans still need to pay for their crimes, we fail to see the gravity of God's judgment on sin as Jesus hangs on the cross. So what's the takeaway? Well, I think God's not an ogre. God's not angry in the same way that I am angry. We are already forgiven because Jesus has already pronounced judgment on sin. And so God's big parade invites us to see judgment in Jesus, who is all at once the King and the Judge and the Lamb of the world, who takes away the sins of the world. That's what I'm thinking about God. What am I thinking about us? Well, number two, forgiveness does not mean everything is okay. Forgiveness does not mean everything is okay. Forgiveness is canceling the debt, not counting people's sins against them. Forgiveness is removing the barrier which makes possible making things okay. But forgiveness doesn't make things okay. Forgiveness is beginning the path towards salvation. But forgiven people who enter and receive that forgiveness, who enter this place of mercy in Christ, who walk with God, they enjoy salvation. They enjoy healing and restoration and deliverance, as Jesus called it, peace or shalom. And so forgiveness does not mean everything is okay, which means that forgiveness, which is true, is an invitation to us. Forgiveness is an invitation to respond. Forgiveness is an invitation to live life abundantly. Now, sometimes we have trouble hearing this invitation because, well, for lots of reasons probably, but one of them is that we think that that message is for non-Christians, for those who are not currently walking or following Jesus. And so we don't hear it. Sometimes we have trouble hearing this invitation because of the noise of the crowd. Where crowds are tricky, and we're often find ourselves in crowds. We're in one right now. We just happen to be super civilized. A couple hundred people allowing only one person to talk. But you're also in a crowd when you're all by yourself and you're scrolling through the echo chamber of doom, various crowds around the world. Crowds can be helpful. They can help us bring us to the right places. And crowds can be super dangerous, bringing us to all the wrong places. Now, we're not given all of the details of who was clamoring around this great parade on the Mount of Olives. Luke tells us that the crowds were there, and they were singing praises. Blessed be the King. The other gospel writers, Hosanna, Hosanna. and the crowds were getting everything right. And it was only a few days later, Luke tells us, that the crowds gathered around and shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him," getting everything wrong. Fortunately, several weeks later, Luke tells us in Acts that the crowds were being added to the number of those being saved, getting everything right. Crowds are tricky. They can be noisy. And sometimes we have trouble hearing this invitation in the crowd. So while it's still quiet in here, might I offer a word, a declaration for us? You are forgiven. You are forgiven, and you are invited to respond to that. You're invited to live because of that abundant life, because of God's mercy, because of Jesus. Now, one day the king will return again. Yeah, we're told maybe in the clouds. And Paul says that we will rise. Okay, so why don't we rise? If you would maybe stand with me if you're able, or if you want. And maybe the music team and the prayer teams I'll invite forward as well. Paul says that we will rise and go out from our cities, and we will meet him in the air. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4. We will meet him in the air because we're rushing out of our cities to welcome the king who is coming home, and then we will parade back home. And we will sing hosannas. We will shout in this big crowd together, participating in God's big parade. I don't know if we're going to have time to grab palm branches on our way on that day. But one thing is for sure, we will hear a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, behold, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." Amen.